Welcome to our next work in progress session. We are here going to hear papers about transcontinental literary journalism. And up first we have Manuel Coutinho from the University of Nova in Lisbon.
Hello everyone. Hello everyone. So this presentation will focus on a couple of interviews that I conducted for my PhD thesis, and hopefully I can show you not only some of the answers given by these renowned Portuguese literary journalists, but I can also share my process of analysis and interviewing. So to first approach this endeavor, I decided that the best way to connect with these literary journalists was to emulate previous interviews that I admired. And following this logic, I decided to consider some works like The New Journalism from 2005. In this book, the author interviews around 20 journalists, and on his approach, he searches for a connection between them. I was particularly taken by this quote, which sums up the book very well. Another great influence, and here we should give this association further credit, was the considerable number of interviews that I found in the journal of the International Association for Literary Journalism Studies. I was particularly influenced by two interviews done by Norman Sims in these respective issues. That being said, after I decided which questions we need to use and which journalists to interview, I then started to read their respective works and study them individually. So I decided to conceive a script of questions. I didn't really have a number in mind, so I considered a total of 20 main questions with a couple of follow-ups, between 1 to 3. After all was said and done, that gave me between 1 hour to 1 hour and 30 minutes per interview. And after transcribing each interview, word by word, it gave me around 25 pages of text. Now, before I consider some of the answers, I would like to point out the names of the journalists that I interviewed, which you can see on the screen. I would like to acknowledge that, on my point of view, these individuals are on the forefront of Portuguese literary journalism. And I would like to recommend Susana Marques' book, which, strangely enough, has already been mentioned today. And it's called Now and at the Hour of Our Death, which has an English translation, and it's widely available. That being said, let's now take a look at some answers. To start off, I would like to present you with two particular questions. So I decided to show you these questions first, and before I consider the answers, I'll explain why I asked these. First off, my study centers on Portuguese literary journalism, and obviously, and foolishly, I might add, a part of me wanted to hear the journalists say that they were, what they considered themselves to be, literary journalists, just because I consider them as such. And again, because I had this idea that literary journalism takes time, longer time than conventional journalism does, I asked them how long it took them to write longer works. Obviously, as you've probably already guessed, these were awful questions, and to be honest, I would even call them bad questions. Bad because of these two moments underlined here, which are vague and point us in the wrong direction. Assuming that a writer or journalist writes purposefully in a certain style is like assuming a painter defines himself by the genre we say he's in. It's like believing Picasso would paint something whilst being worried that people called him a cubist or something else. As I found out, these journalists thought the same way. It's not important to them the genre in which I or any other academic would put them, as long as their work was recognized as journalism. And this, although not obvious at first, seems quite logical. These were bad questions because they treated literary journalism as a mathematical equation, as a process that can be quantified, measured, and reproduced, which is in fact an important separation between literary journalism and conventional journalism. I obviously only understood that these were bad questions after I started hearing their answers, which were quite vague, as you can see. But don't lose all hope, because there were other questions which seem to be more on point. So, There were two subjects that I wanted to confirm or deny in these interviews. One of them is taken from a quote from Manuel in the book The Art of Fact, in which he stated that each practitioner of literary journalism stands on the shoulders of his or her predecessor. So naturally, I asked these 4 journalists about their influences, why they chose to write long-form journalism, and who they considered as references in their area. Another important subject that I wanted to approach is the connection between literary journalism and subjectivity. Both questions interested me, so I asked them, and on each subject, I was surprised with their answers. I found it extremely interesting that among these 4 journalists, some of them stated each other as references within Portuguese journalism. Perhaps that happened because Portuguese journalism isn't as big as it is in other countries, but still, I found this quite compelling. Concerning the subjectivity, the second question here on the board, I found their answers also captivating. Subjectivity being, in my point of view, one of the most difficult subjects to explain within the concept of literary journalism. Although subjectivity doesn't define this genre as a whole, I believe it to be quite present in the writing of these 4 journalists. So it was great to hear them explain their motives and reasoning behind their journalistic and literary choices. So I could spend a couple of hours speaking about each answer individually, but I'll try and finish this presentation with just a couple more. Another thing that I found important to talk about during these interviews was the connection they each had with their subject of analysis. I was particularly interested in this topic after I read Anne Hull's experience in the book Telling True Stories from 2005, in which the reporter remembers a dilemma that affected her immersive journalism, a dilemma that would have compromised her story, and with good reason. The 4 journalists that I interviewed are all also quite immersive in their areas, sometimes spending months with their subject of analysis. Again, concerning this topic, I was also taken away by their answers, but also by their strict and structured ethics when on the job. Of course that while doing an interview, you are subject to answers that are constructed, thought out, and created in hindsight, and with a filter that sometimes takes away unnecessary or unwarranted information. And yet, each journalist seemed to be very honest and practical, mainly because their jobs are extremely concrete and on the field. Each gave me examples, 3 examples, that showed how some of the theory that I had been studying for the past months would lose its flexibility when on the job. In this way, their answers impressed me. I would like to finish with this question, which in retrospect, I thought at the time that I had struck gold. I thought in a way that journalists might have a hard time answering this question, that I might stop them in their tracks. But again, I was wrong. They all individually agreed on journalism's role in portraying reality, with the reporter's point of view. If I can take something from these interviews, is that each agreed that while working on the facts, the journalist will try and reproduce a story with the elements that best suit the narrative you want to tell, the narrative you want to tell. In the process, of course, as each journalist pointed out, you have to be honest to the story, to yourself and to your readers, with no intentions of derailing them towards a certain conclusion, but helping them reach a more informed position whilst connecting with a vision, the vision of the reporter. As I work on these interviews, I find more and more interesting and compelling their answers that were given to me, which continuously challenge some of my previous findings. In other words, I believe that approaching the reporters and asking them to interview them, to talk with them, if they are available and willing, proved to be a great decision, since I found that hearing them speak about their writing, craft, and narrative choices allowed me to perceive their works with a greater enlightenment. Thank you.
Now we have Lesley Cowling from the University of Wits, South Africa, laying it on the line.
so this is work in progress because it's an intersection of two areas that I'm interested in, and I'm not quite certain how to proceed. So the one area that I'm interested in is the impact on media, on public debate and public discussion. So media influence in the way in which we think about how we collectively mediate our existence. And then the other area that I'm interested in is literary journalism and particularly the tactics that writers use to write their stories and to do that kind of thing. So this project grew out of another project that I was doing on the Sowetan newspaper, which is a newspaper that it grows out of the legacy of the black press in South Africa, and it's a newspaper which has a history of really representing and presenting the political aspirations of black South Africans under apartheid and in the post-apartheid era. And it was historically focused on a disenfranchised black urban community, and in particular it was known for a project called Nationbuilding of the late 1980s and 1990s, and it became an extremely influential newspaper and is credited with creating a black public that thought of itself as the nation in waiting and as the citizens of the new society. So a lot of my original work on Sowetan, on some of the history, was to look at, what sorts of things the newspaper did in order to promote this idea of nation building in the 80s and early 90s. So, nation building as a term implies something that we all take for granted that, quality newspapers do, basically, which is to position in such a way as to draw the readers together and to think about what's good for the society. But in fact, in this apartheid context for the black press, it was a very invidious position in which to be, because it was serving a black readership rather than the entire, the media was very fragmented into, white papers and black papers. And they were serving citizens and readers who were not given rights in the society. So it presented them with a difficult position to take. Okay, and you can see when the Sowetan, just before the Sowetan was established, the government had shut down two papers, the predecessors of the Sowetan. So it was a difficult environment in which to work. Okay. In this environment, especially with scrutiny from the state and harassment and arrest and from the state against people who took anti-apartheid positions, black editors had a very difficult time. And they needed to present to their readers, to be able to talk about the experiences that their readers were having and to talk about the political possibilities for their readers. But as you can see from the headline, moderates are now totally discounted. In the 80s, the politics on the ground was extremely conflictual. So people took very different positions in the black community about whether they should be rebellious, whether they should work to some extent to try and change the system from within. So it was a very difficult environment. This is an interesting project because this actually happened in the 80s, long before Mandela was released, and at a time when we didn't even think that he would ever be released. The white elections were taking place, and the Sowetan decided to hold their own elections with their readers, and they actually had these little ballots which they had people send into the newspaper, and then they counted the ballots and they excluded some of them that they said didn't meet the requirements, and then they sort of totaled up like who had been voted in, and Mandela was voted in first. He he won the vote. It was also an act of rebellion against the state, but it's an act of rebellion that kind of models what it would be like to be voting citizens in a society. Shortly after this guy, Klaaste, who you see here with his teacup, and you can see with his office, the back, there was a very famous picture which was of 1976 of the student uprisings in the black townships, and a scholar was shot, and this is a very famous picture of one of the school kids carrying him, Hector Peterson. There's now a memorial to him. So that is the legacy that Klaaste comes out of, is that 76 legacy of a newspaper that was quite confrontational of the state and very aligned with black consciousness. But he, as an editor, had a different idea of the way in which the newspaper should go forward, and he felt there was a lot of infighting in the townships around different political positions within the black community, and some of it led to intense violence. And there was this kind of saying amongst more radical people, which was things like no education without liberation, so we're going to shut everything down until things change. And he felt like it was too destructive, that the black communities were being destroyed by these things. And he also felt that different political parties should be able to talk to each other. So he launched what he called the big idea, which was nation building. And you can see that, I apologize for these old clippings. I got them from a website which is scanned in some old clippings from the university. So Klaaste, you can see the play with I Have a Dream, you can see the play with Martin Luther King there. And the dream is that he wants to save the country by promoting this idea of nation building, which he then went ahead and did in a whole lot of projects through the paper. This is a picture of some of the guys at the Sowetan in that era. The Sowetan was an interesting place because a lot of the journalists had become very activists. They'd been radicalized by their experiences and by their contacts with Beaker and the black consciousness movements of the 70s. So when Aggrey came with his nation building idea, they were like, this is middle class stuff, this is, it's collaborating with the state and we shouldn't be doing this kind of thing. But he managed to persuade them by having constant ongoing discussions with them, and so he began to promote these nation building ideas also through columns and articles in the newspaper. And this is one example. So Lesley Sibidi, who was a black intellectual, an academic, was invited to write on Ubuntu, which is a key value in African society, which I think you could translate to you are because I am because you are, and you are because I am. It's an idea of that. So he began with the columns, and then also they began projects in the community, which in some ways are quite middle class. Just like cleaning up the litter and growing little gardens, and education was very big, but there was a black consciousness element in that. It was, we can't wait for the white state to do things for us in our communities. We've got to do these things for ourselves. And in fact, Aggrey wrote in one of his columns, in Africa, as countries have got independence, they've had to do all of these things for ourselves. So he was kind of looking forward to that time. One of the key sort of cornerstones of the nation building project was that Aggrey himself wrote this column every week, and there was another writer at the newspaper who wrote a column. In the time of which nation building was being promoted, the the column wrote a lot about nation building. So when I first did the project on the Sowetan, I was looking at the newspaper and its relationship to a black public and how it was defining itself. But I also became quite interested in Aggrey's columns. And that's where it intersects with the media and public debate thing, because columns, political columns are often written in quite a rational, critical style. An argument is made and it is mounted, and it rolls out in a certain kind of way. And Aggrey's columns were not like that. And as I was reading the stuff, I thought, well, he's a bit rambling. He's got these ideas, but he's rambling all over the place. But at some point, I started to feel that he was actually doing something interesting with the column. That instead of taking one political position and arguing it, he was actually using certain strategies to bring ideas into dialogue with each other, which in a sense was modeling the ways in which different people in the black community and different parties could dialogue with each other. So it was his column On the Line. And this column, let's give it a shot. It's a long column about him and this friend of his, okay, who have this discussion about what they should do in the situation. So here he talks about his friend as he's no paragon of virtue, he's not sanctimonious, he cringes with embarrassment at the usual manner in which black leaders play to and for applause. He's also tough, loving, and has the quality of Ubuntu almost shining through his personality. He loves even his enemies. I'm not saying he's prepared to forgive and forget in the manner that I've explicated Ubuntu. So he introduces this friend who he doesn't name and gives him his character. Then he goes on to model the dialogue that he has with him. He has taught me that perhaps we are almost fated to pay the heaviest of prices for our mistakes. He believes we must go through the bloodbath almost as a cathartic exercise. And he has also shown me that some elements of Marxism he supports are almost African in their makeup. So Aggrey's position of nation building is then juxtaposed with his friend's position of like we've got to tear down the system. And then he goes on, I don't have the whole column, but he sort of goes on to talk about that this is the end of it. He says, I say to my friend, is it not better for us to build the hands, to develop the minds and skills that will rebuild this country if we don't want to go the whole hog to damnation? He smiles ruefully and says, give it a shot. So, but this is where I've got a little bit stuck in thinking through the research, because it's much easier to look at a newspaper over time and hypothesize that it's building a certain kind of public and that it has a certain kind of influence. But when it comes to column writing, even if it's a column that's repeating, I mean, how do we assess the influence of column writing? And then what do fictional tactics such as voice dialogue and narrative contribute to public discussion? This is another interesting question. When can column writing be defined as literary journalism, and how should it be studied? And what analytical approaches are useful in studying columns and opinion formation? So this is what I brought to the work in progress for other people to weigh in if you've got any ideas. And that's my presentation.
Thank you, Lesley. We can maybe hear some of that weighing in when we do our Q&A. All right. Next we have Pascal from Carleton University in Canada with literary journalism from the margins of translation.
It's not clear. Was it that one? Oh, that's the one? Which one?
The red space.
This one?
No, that's mine.
Oh, that's one. I don't see. Oh, there it is. I don't see.
Oh, I see. That one,
Yes.
yeah.
Oh, you want
Thank you.
Okay.
I want to raise with you today a very simple question. How much does literary journalism circulate in translation? Very basic question. I came upon this issue of translation within the context of a different project. As I was doing some preliminary work on the reception of John Hersey's 1946 Hiroshima, I looked at translation patterns around Hersey's literary reportage, and I was struck by the disparities between the wide circulation enjoyed by Hiroshima in translation and the scarcity of translation for Hersey's other book form reportage. And even though Hersey also enjoyed some reasonable visibility in translation as an author of fiction. I presented the result of this case study at our MLA meeting last year, but clearly my curiosity was not abated, so I decided to follow up with a second case study that shifts the focus of inquiry on another language, a different period, but very much with the intent to probe how little of literary journalism actually gets translated. I wanted to approximate the seemingly translation-prone conditions that characterize Hersey's profile as a literary journalist. Certainly his use of English as an hegemonic language, but also the status derived from his single groundbreaking canon-making reportage. So for that purpose, I shifted to French as a language of cultural prestige and relevance. I settled on the first half of the past century, described by some as the golden age for literary reportage in France, and I set up a comparison between two authorial figures endowed with much cultural capital. The first is the quintessential figure of the genre in France, Albert Londres, who penned mostly in the 20s and 30s more than 15 books previously serialized in the press for some, and whose investigations on carceral conditions in French colonies or sexual trafficking between France and Argentina earned him wide notoriety. The second figure is a lesser literary journalist who was mostly involved with the genre over a 10-year period as at a penultimate stage in his literary career, and I'm referring here to Blaise Cendrars and his narrative non-fiction productions, such as his reportage on Hollywood or his long piece on a controversial figure of colonial authority in Guyana. If a more modest literary journalist than Albert Londres, Cendrars brings to the comparison an immense literary prestige. He carved very early on a literary name for himself as a major poet within European avant-garde, and only strengthened his position as a novelist and memoir writer of world stature. So Cendrars brings, in fact, to this other case study, a literary capital far more extensive than that of Hersey ever was. Yet, as was the case with Hersey, the literary journalism of Londres and Cendrars combined would seem to gather the conditions for significant circulation of their work in European languages translation. As it so happened, it is not the case. Cendrars' 5 publications were limited to a circulation of no more than 13 translations, and this is in fact very similar to the restricted translation output associated with Hersey's literary journalism, aside from Hiroshima, 5 titles and 12 translations. For Londres, although he enjoyed a more robust bibliography with 14 to 15 titles surveyed rather than 5, this only yielded 28 translations. That seems a lot, but as a point of comparison, Hiroshima alone as a single text title generated at least 21 translations. Or again, if you take the sizable sample of Cendrars' strictly literary production I surveyed, 17 titles in poetry and novels, they generated 71 translations. So here again, despite highly promising conditions, translation occurs in relative moderation. So to probe this further, I will now briefly consider space-time and cultural agency as they relate to the translation of literary journalism. Overall, geo-linguistic mapping points to a limited presence of translated literary journalism within Western literary systems. Bearing in mind the more than impressive spread achieved by Hersey's Hiroshima across 17 European languages, Albert Lond's cumulative output is limited to 8 languages, whereas Blaise Cendrar's more modest corpus only reaches translation in 6 European languages. So clearly here, Cendrar's literary prestige does not yield an increased visibility for literary journalism. Not only does Cendrar's reportage literature fail to emulate the moderate reach in translation enjoyed by Londres, but more significantly, it pales in comparison to Cendrar's literary output in translation, with a spread of 11 languages. So, despite the stage set by Albert Londres in the first decades of the 20th century, despite the cultural capital accumulated over the same period by Cendrars as a leading literary figure, his literary journalism appears to be rather marginalized in terms of reception through translation, as was the case with the rest of Hersey's narrative nonfiction, aside then from Hiroshima. The geolinguistic spread is not, of course, linear and requires some sort of 3D mapping to account for density. Out of the 8 or 6 literary systems involved, some are characterized by a higher incidence of translation than others. In the case of Londres, we can easily point to 3 nodes in the network of diffusion through translation. The Spanish, German, and more moderately Italian literary systems account for about 70% of all translation produced. Peripheral nodes of translation activity, with a limited output of 1 to 3 titles, are English, surprisingly, Dutch, Danish, Swedish, and Polish. And this is mostly on a par with what the analysis of Hersey's translation pointed out. Spanish, German, Italian form the major group. The secondary grouping would be Dutch and Latin Portuguese, and there is some peripheral translation in Scandinavian, Baltic, or Slav languages. Here again, Cendrar's literary journalism enjoys a more limited spread than Londres, involving nonetheless similar central or peripheral literary systems. What is striking, however, in both Londres and Cendrar's case is the very weak position of English literary systems, whether American or British. Not only is a rather limited output in translation circumscribed to a few centers, but the bulk of translation is sustained in languages other than English. So English is a very minor player in terms of the circulation of the genre. Beyond the geolinguistics entry point in this or that literature, we must also engage with the temporal landscape. And Londres' journalistic production in translation follows, in this regard, 3 different chronologies. Out of 28 translations, 16 gain contemporary access to foreign readership. They are published within a couple of years, at most, of the French original publication. So, literary journalism's customary focus on the here and now is largely matched in translation by an integration within a foreign literary system as current event-based new publication. But this is the case, there is also about, this is the case for about 2/3 of the translation, but there's another third, about 10 of them, that conform to a late translation pattern, occurring mostly in the 90s and the 2000s. So this feature points obviously to the ability for the genre to sustain some publishing interest across time and beyond the mere immediacy value of current event publication. And not surprisingly, the 2 systems the most engaged with dynamics of translation, Germany and Spain, are also the ones that sustain translation diachronically, with a mix of both contemporary and belated translations. Interestingly, when we shift the focus to Cendrars, the pattern is reversed. Out of 13 translations, only 2 are contemporaries of Cendrars' original work, with 11 making their way in other literatures in the 80s and 90s for the most part. So Cendrars' work of reportage appears in translation to remain marginal to the early canonization of his literary output across many other systems. Literary prestige as cultural capital would seem here to hinder, or at the very least to defer, the potential for seeing literary journalism in translation, as if a lesser production were eventually revisited, but due to the authorial stature enjoyed by the author of literature. On the other hand, Literature Time configures rather differently Londres as an authorial figure. He is both a non-fiction writer, published, translated, and very much framed within the immediacy of his historical moment, and a literary journalist enjoying a late or belated revival. Yet, translations do not occur in the void. They are not simply situated in time and space. They also require mediators that participate in constricting a readership. Publishers, act of translation, translators are relevant markers in this regard. As far as publishers are concerned for Londres, we seem on the whole to have a peripheral literary production that conforms to a scattered publication pattern, where multiple publishers are involved, but with single title ventures, rather than building a library of titles. With two notable exceptions, though, for Londres. Both the German and Spanish literary system point to publishing nodes where a single publisher capitalizes on multiple titles. This occurs twice in the 30s, and this is replicated again in the year 2000, with a single publisher then building up authorial presence through a series of late translation. Literary reportage enjoys here the sort of literary investment conducive to recognized visibility in any system. If we focus now on retranslation of Londres literary reportage, we find that they occur within the very same two literary systems, with two retranslations on the German side and one for Spanish publications. Retranslating any work is, of course, the act by which any cultural import is endowed both with relative literary perennity, but also accrued cultural thickness or relevance, since it is deemed worthy of a further rewrite into the target system. What is at work then both in the German and Spanish translation is a sort of literaturization of reportage in translation, which displays in print some of the features of mainstream literary production. Finally, this is further corroborated on the German side by the very identity of one of the translators retained for Londres reportage. Whereas the vast majority of translators cannot be traced to a position of relevance across literary institutions, Alexander Benzion, a renowned literary translator, is tasked on 3 occasions with bringing Londres' work to German readership. The situation is both similar and different for the author-turned-reporter Sandra. Once again, even though translations are overall rather limited in numbers, we can observe some concentration of publishers over a series of titles, and also some retranslation. The difference, however, lies with the stark contrast between Sandra's literary output and his journalistic production. Rewrites, second or third translations, run into the double digits for Sandra's literary titles, more than 25, whereas we only find a couple for his literary journalism. So, as a way to conclude, why would this approach from the margin of translation matter to the study of literary journalism? I think it matters incredibly if we mean to engage with the global or transnational status, claims, potential of the genre. I think it matters epistemically in the sense that it provides for a different understanding of how literary production functions beyond close readings and the traditional over-investment in text and author. But I think it also matters, I would say almost civically in a sense, because if so little of literary journalism gets actually translated, and if as a community of scholars we are convinced of the acute relevance of that sort of writing, who better than us than to address this paucity and possibly engage in some different translation, scholarly translation with critical revisions.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Pascal. We will now hear from Hilde van Belle from Leuven, Belgium, The Voyage in the Dark.
I have a couple of translations of this text. Thank you. Good afternoon. I will talk to you about Joris van Casteren, and especially about the book he wrote about the love story of himself. I will talk about that, and that book generated a lot of controversy, so that's why I think it's an interesting theme to talk about. that's him, you can see, he's quite young. He was born in 76, and already in 2004 he received a prize for young journalists, and the jury report says that he has a remarkable power of observation, that he's quietly peeling his theme layer by layer, that he's creating a bizarre world written down as if it were almost normal, and with a perfect doses of slightly ironic overtone. So you can see that his style is special, and they're trying to, to put down exactly what he's doing. Before I talk about the love book, I will say just a little bit about another one, Lelystad, that was published in 2008. That's a book about his youth, where he's telling about his own experiences growing up in Lelystad, which is part of the new land. I'll show that to you. The new land in Holland. So they took from the sea, this whole part they took from the sea. Here we have Amsterdam, Utrecht, and this is a whole part they just, filled with sand and all that, and they built new cities on top of that. And so that's where he grew up. And with his progressive parents, all those people were idealistic, they were pioneers, and they were, they tried a lot of things, and a lot of things went wrong. So the Architectonic Order, and the city was built by engineers, but the Architectonic Order didn't work. It became a social nightmare. So his problematic youth was described in that book. It was youth of alienation, emptiness. He was emotionally lost at some point, but he has, again, this special style. It's a mix of reportage, autobiography, and history writing. He almost gives no explanation, no interpretation, and no reflection by the eye narrator, which is strange, so it gives a mysterious aspect. The reader is often at a loss about the function and meaning of some descriptions. But yet there are exceptions, and in the handout you can see one exception. I printed it dark. So he's in this quite meaningless city growing up, and then at some point he's watching TV about Dutch experimental poets, and then he says, that evening I discovered what a metaphor was. In Lelystad, things were just as simple as they were. A mailbox was a mailbox, a parking lot was a parking lot, etc. So once in a while he does say very important things about symbols and about interpretation and all that, but he doesn't do that all the time. So you have to be careful, reader, in order to see when he does that, when he's interpreting, and when he's really saying something. The book I want to talk about now is The Bride's Little Sister, Tale of an Impossible Love, and it's about Yuna. That's not her real name, of course, because it really happened and he wants to protect her, so it's not her real name. She was a rich, intelligent, good-looking, humorous and talented borderline patient, addicted to alcohol and drugs. And he fell in love with her. And Joris from Casteren, a journalist, writing reportages about social situations. For instance, a famous one is The Man Who Lied Dead for 2.5 years. And their love story was in 2001-2002. And it's remarkable that as a journalist, the eye narrator is a journalist, he's also talking about his writing. So it's not a type, he's just talking about the reportages he's making and the interviews he's doing, etc. The plot is quite chronological. They meet, they have their ups and downs, and then he leaves her. The style is an accumulation of short, straight, often paratactic main poses, and also the structure is quite paratactic. So you have those sequences, they follow one another, and there's not always a clear line. And that also gives an effect of alienation. There's a lost narrator, there's a lack of control, things just seem to happen. That's the effect it creates. No introspection of the eye narrator, except for the exceptions. I showed you one in the other book. Little interpretation of her thoughts and motives, a dominant focus on her words and actions trigger the plot, and Joris is mainly reacting to her actions. So she's really in the center. Sometimes his reactions are proactive when he's trying to prevent her from drinking or something. The text is a description of setting, action, and quotes. So more showing than telling. And the dramatic tension I would like I would say that it's mainly the dry, unreflective style versus the tragic events and the shocking details. I would say that would be the main dramatic tension. Then there is one peculiar aspect in the book, and that's the naming. We have two names, Luna and Joris, and then for the rest we have no names anymore, but periphrases all the time. For instance, Luna's father, he's a show manager. His colleagues have their names. For instance, the poet who also was an editor, that's one of his colleagues. And then there's also the wife of the poet who also was an editor. And at some point it's hilarious, but at another point it can be very dramatic as well. You know, it shifts. You know, sometimes it's tragic, sometimes it's comic. And now I want to tell you about the controversy that the book generated, and I will focus on two articles. The first one is, the first cut is the deepest, journalistic decay of a relation swindler. You know, she's very angry at him, Natasha Vincent. And she really is appealing to the journalistic literary conscience. She pleads for ethical revival in the media and publishers. She's shocked. He shows sick and without emotion his disloyalty to his forlorn ex-lover without any self-reflection. And she's shocked at that. And she's saying, well, you know, it's good. You know, I was shocked by him. I'm a trained reader, and he even manages to shock me with the disgusting scenes. And the only thing that she also remarks is, well, there's this new literary tradition of borderline girls apparently in the Netherlands. You know, writers writing novels about that, and Joris van Casteren is now doing the same. He calls it love, but there's no sign of it at all. It's a bloodless registration trick, and his character, well, it's all wrong. The conclusion, the book is a journalistic nadir. There's the pretext of journalism as an excuse for an irresponsible book by a well-educated parvenu, as a new landmark in his career, so he will profit of it. And, you know, it's a lunatic who shouldn't tackle delicate topics anymore. And, you know, the scolding in Dutch is even worse than that, but I couldn't find good English for that. The second one is Elsbeth Etty, safely living together in a dangerous life. And she's a little bit more careful about her attack. She's saying the reportage is a wrong genre for the topic. So she plays that card. Non-fiction, she says, can be useful, successful, but this is no place for mystification. What works for a city, like in Lelystad, irony about a dystopia, does not work for a tragic love. So that she says, in Lelystad, it's okay that he went from apparently banal details to meaning, but in The Bride's Little Sister, it's the opposite. It goes from tragedy to banality, and so that's wrong. Van Casteren did not find a literary solution for the difference. That's what she says. Journalism should debunk, whereas he does not do that. Luna is a cover name, but it's easy to trace. And Van Casteren, he's too involved to objectify. He's probably even guilty to her fate. Poetry or fiction work better for an intimate topic, such as a decay of personal love. So that's what she says. And then she goes on about the motives of the I narrator. She has a lot of questions about those. Which is strange. She says, for instance, about at one point, he's joining Luna in a heron trip at her question, and then she says, well, he doesn't feel anything. That's what he says. And this is the quote from the book. It was raining. I didn't care. I got wet. Nothing mattered anymore. I didn't feel any love for Luna. I didn't feel any love for anything. Well, that's a question of shock. I mean, at that point, he's just in shock, you know. You can't say, oh, yo, he doesn't feel anything. That's ridiculous. He's feeling, it's complete agony what he's feeling there. So, of course, he says at that point he doesn't feel his love for Luna. So, and this absence of feelings, as she calls it, is counts for the flat, colorless tone throughout the book. And would that be maybe a sign of journalistic distance? So she's again talking about the genre. But why does he leave out facts? And by facts, she means the names, you know, the naming thing I told you about. And why does he refer to pieces he wrote in that time? You know, those pieces, he's talking about the interviews he's doing and all that. Would that be to prove his writing capacities? Would that be to criticize the impersonal journalism of the magazine? Would that be to reject incompetent colleagues, or would that be kind of revenge? She has a lot of questions about that. More questions about the lack of the author's motives throughout the book. Why did he want Luna? Why do she and her parents reject any contact now? Why does this merit a reportage, etc.? Only in the end, she says, there is some indication of his motives, and that's a nice quote as well. She says, when somebody asks him about his motives to choose Luna, he answers, and this is a quote from the book, I long to be suicidal or addicted to, but then in a safe way. I thought that I could realize this with her. And I think here too, it's a very human thing, you know, to be attracted by danger, but then to try and find a way to have a safe way, you know, to experience danger. So I think that too is a very human psychological thing to see. But our critic, she just has contempt for that. And also for the weak last sentence of this report, she's also very negative about that. The last sentence is like, it's up to you, Luna, if that's what you want, fine, but one day I'll stand by your grave and cry for everything. And Elsbeth Etty says, I have no clue about the aim of this book. It's no fiction, no literary non-fiction, and definitely no journalism. At most, it is a failed report about a failed law. So she's very, mad about it. Now, that's the last article I want to talk. That's the reply by Joris van Casteren. And the title is now put down that pen, you, because papers had been telling that they would refuse his pieces. So it was really, you know, papers just told him, well, you don't write for us anymore. And he gives a personal account of Lelystad. Well, that was the expression of my own problematic youth. Of the bright little sister, that was an expression of this intense and tragic relationship. And he decided, after a long time, he decided to write about that. It was painful, but a clarifying process. And then the whole thing about the magazine and his colleagues, well, he's trying to minimize that. You know, they're an accidental or they're anonymized. And then he says, it had to be a loving book. Loving towards her, but also hard and merciless, as the times with her often were. I wanted, as always, present the shocking situations, dry and without emotions. I leave it to the reader to interpret and to judge. So that's what he does, and I think that's really what he's very conscious about that. And then on Natasha Gerson, he says simply criticism for a book on moral ground is a curious affair. And on Elsbeth Etty, a very intelligent remark. Books about alarming topics that come dangerously close by should better be fiction, she claims. Then we can always say how fortunate it is that it is not real, but made up. Whereas the debunking of this non-commitment is exactly the power of literary non-fiction. And I think that's a very true thing he says there. The other opinions I will skip, except for the Gert Pols, who says, well, it's an intelligence girl desperate protest against the conforming multi-parents, against the Dutch mentality of denial. You know, he calls it a solution country. You know, Holland can be a real solution country. We want a solution for everything. And this is my conclusion. So if you make a list of everything that they blame him for, so the standards for journalism that are behind that are, you don't write about intimate topics because then you lose your objectivity and your authority. It should be ethically proof, not about your own mistakes, not about your failings, not about tragic loves. So when you do write about a love story, you should reveal your emotions of love and shame clearly. You should reveal your own motivations clearly. You shouldn't write any disgusting scenes. You shouldn't write about wealthy borderline girls. You shouldn't write about your own writing or job situation or your colleagues. You shouldn't omit facts. You shouldn't show any interest in journalistic writing career, nor in writing funds you have. And you should draw clear lines between fiction, literary non-fiction, and journalism. So if you, to me, you know, my conclusion is it's really a matter of authority. So the journalists, they should keep their authority, they should keep their moral authority according to those critics, and they should keep their text authority. no intimate topics or personal failures, no explicit misery, no mentioning of professional context, and for text authority, no explanations, and they should give enough explanations and interpretations, and that's what Joris van Casteren doesn't do. He doesn't give much explanation and interpretation, and that's what really scares them, I would say. And no mentioning of your own writing. And oh, it's time. Okay. Well, I refer to the text I translated for you to see something more about the meaning he tries to give to the things that happen. Thank you.
Great. Let's Manuel back up here and we'll do some questions and comments.
I'm kind of baffled by the reaction to this book. Really?
Yeah.
People are that frightened of a book?
Because he's been writing he's known as a journalist, and I think that's the whole story. So he's not known as a literary author, but as a journalist. So, and I think that's what triggered the whole thing.
You can't do this because you're a journalist?
Yeah, because it's reality. That's what she said. You should make fiction out of it, and then everybody would accept it. But also, what I think one of the things they reproach him is also that's one of the things I think it's about a rich girl, and so people might know who she is and who her parents are, and I think that's something revealing for us too, because literary journalists, they often write about poor people in misery, and everybody accepts that. But the moment they write about rich people, known people, about other journalists, and all that, I think that's really something threatening. I think that says something about traditional journalism, and we can write about a lot of things that don't come too close.
Can I ask one more question? So when you read it, did you enjoy it?
Oh yes, it's a great book. Yeah, and he does love her. Yeah, it's nice, but it's special because of this lack of interpretation. It's special, things happen, and he doesn't give interpretations. He doesn't give any motivations. Once in a while, but then you have to be very careful and to see when that happens.
Okay, so what happens inside your head when you're reading? Do you start layering on? I mean, can you not help yourself to layer on some interpretation from? In other words, you're bringing your own experiences, or love affairs, or life in general, or whatever. You're sort of superimposing that onto, because he's leaving so much open to interpretation. You use your life experience in order to be able to follow it. I can follow the story just because I'm a human, I would say. The reactions are all very human, because he loves her, but then it's tragic what happens to her, and he tries again so it's like he pities her and he wants to help her, and at one point it works and at another point it does. So he's desperate, and that I can follow very, very well. It's very, you can really understand it just from being human.
May I?
Yeah.
On the same book. First of all, it reminded me of John Didion, Blue Nights, and the Year of the Magical Thinking. Besides being a literary journalist researcher, I am a Jungian psychoanalyst and psychotherapist, and it really occurred to me that if he were my patient, I would start by asking why, trying to figure out why he has chosen a borderline woman, okay? But that's not the point here. The point is that why the reviewers were so because under this frame, this mind frame, probably they were projecting some of their own shadows, into the books. So why it's okay, when you read a book on a heart attack of a woman, of a journalist, and everybody adores it, okay? But then, when it's involving some dark sides of a person,
Of the journalist.
of a journalist, it's not okay. So it's intriguing. Probably it won't reach a Portuguese translation, but it's amazing, interesting book. I'm glad I was here to listen to you. Thanks.
Isn't the first question you asked, did you dream last night?
No, it's a second.
Can I ask something? How was the book publicized? How was it sold? Was it sold like with this new journalism book, or was on the market next day?
He was famous already. So in 2004, he also received this prize for young journalists, and the book is 2011. So he was kind of famous. So it was a new Joris van Casteren, but the Lelystad one was his first autobiographical work, and this was the second autobiographical work, and that was more threatening, I think. And as Holland, I'm not Dutch, you know, Holland has more this idea of the solution country, you know, things should be solved, you know. So yeah.
Fix that woman.
That's an illusion.
Yeah.
May I have one question to Manuel? Maybe two questions, and I will be back to my literary journalist researcher career now, okay? You said you chosen Paulo Moura, Thiago Carrasco, Alexandre, and Susana. I understand they are fine examples of literary journalists in Portugal, but I didn't understand why you have chosen precisely them. And the second one is really out of curiosity, because we are going into this in Brazil right now. Did you have to get approval to work with human subjects to conduct this research in Portugal, or you just go there and interview them?
So the first question, the criteria that I had to choose them, my idea was to work on journalists from the 21st century. I didn't have a lot of time a lot of authors to be preoccupied, just 2 decades. And so I chose 2 main figures of Portuguese journalists, older figures who've been in journalism for a while, which is Paulo Moura and Alexandre Lucas Coelho. And then I decided to choose 2 younger journalists. So I chose Susana Moura Marques and Tiago Carrasco. So
And
that
by
was
youngers, you mean?
just started writing in the 2000s, and who had a career which I could see as being considered as literary journalists. About the second question, I really don't know. I don't have an answer for if it's needed or not in Portugal.
So it's not because you.
No, it's probably not.
I see.
I've never heard of a need for that. So.
We have an exemption at Ryerson in Canada.
Oh, yeah?
The journalism school got an exemption because it would be impossible for us to do our work. We have to do these, get these permissions. We'd be running into
At my university, they also try and do that, and we just ignore them. I mean, I don't think they realise, but we just ignore them.
Yeah, that's
because it would be, it's impossible, because our
every time
students
you want to
are journalists.
you'll get permission.
You need like a blanket waiver for journalists.
In Brazil right now we have this new regulation that if it is an interview, yes, okay, but at my university we can do that pretty fast, so it's not really a big issue. But at USP, University of São Paulo, it could take 1.5 years, so it's an issue. But now, if it is a survey, you don't need permission. So sometimes, depending on the student and how fast you need to conduct the study, you just do it through survey. You cannot have this personal contact.
The former chair of the School of Journalism, Ivor Shapiro, he put it very well. He said, okay, let's think about this. Do we really want to bomb the research ethics board with all of these requests, like from all of our students, every day of the week, hundreds of requests? They're going to look at us and go, ah, no, you know, get out of here. Like, we could clog them up so fast. And that would be a strategy. Like, if it comes to that in Sao Paulo, it's just like, just bomb them with, like, you know, 4,000 requests, and then they'll realize that they can't do that in Germany.
Yeah, we just have to say the number, you know? Let's say I will be conducting an interview with 500 people, you know? So we just score high and
they'll go, ah, okay.
So I think Manuel and Hilde are very interesting bookends in kind of different ways of eliciting a definition or some assumptions about what literary journalism is. And it's almost like, you know, not to go in the psychoanalytic, but it's almost like Manuel asks directly and you almost get the conscious response, whereas what Hilde's done is actually look at their text and reading out their assumptions.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting how these two different approaches kind of mirror each other. And I mean, I think that was kind of the most fascinating thing about, you know, what you were talking about, and I really loved how at the end you brought out that summary. It's like, okay, so based on what they're saying, here's their rules, and here's how they're defining it and boxing it, and it almost says more about them and their assumptions.
Of course.
So it's kind of interesting, whereas I think, you know, kind of the conscious sort of writerly conversations that Manuel was able to have with some of these people, you also get some very interesting reflections as well. But it's almost like, you know, the id and the superego of yeah, but very, very interesting.
Well, and if I can add to that you brought your own assumptions to your questions, but you were willing to like listen to what the journalist said as opposed to just going, no, my assumptions are the way that things are.
I have a question for Lesley. The Ubuntu thing, that's fascinating. Could you tell a bit more about that?
Okay, so there has been in South Africa, and I think in a lot of countries that have experienced colonialism, a sense that, you know, the indigenous philosophical systems and moral systems by which people lived were kind of swamped by other systems, Christianity or whatever. And so there's been this process of recovery or attempt to recover some of these ideas. So this Ubuntu thing, in fact, I think it starts to emerge in the 80s in relation to this nation building as well, but it's subsequently been written about a lot. Was a way to sort of talk about African ways of living together, which were around this, I suppose, an imagined idea of we work together as a community, and that's been juxtaposed to the individualism of the Western way and those sorts of things.
That brings up a really interesting point about your question and how to get into and almost you know, kind of an analytical approach for the, this writer's commentaries. Whereas if you think about it and you back up, the way that you described the usual approach really is the Western approach, and whereas there is Ubuntu in his thing, like central to it, right? So I mean, you only shared that, you know, really that one thing, but that might be an interesting thing to look at in terms of just kind of a style, and is it unique to him too, and see, you know, if you're seeing it anyplace else.
Yeah, I think it's pretty unique to him.
Do you know if it was conscious?
I don't. I mean, I could ask people. He died, you know, in
a way,
2004. But I do know people who worked with him and for him. So I don't know if it is, but it may not have been conscious, but it was certainly his approach to, I mean, I did a lot of interviews at Sowetan because it was part of my PhD, so the people would talked about him, and they said, well, his door was always open, and we would go in there and say, well, we don't want this nation building, and this is just rubbish, and he would then just have an ongoing discussion about it. Whether he was consciously doing that in the columns, like this is my tactic, or whether he was just driven because it was his, because he was motivated by wanting to do this stuff, I don't know. But the thing is about when you think about the Habermasian idea of rational critical debate and that kind of enlightenment idea of this is the way you make an argument, you know. His writing was very different from that.
What I do in column analysis, I do quite a lot of column analysis with the students, and it's a rhetorical analysis, so I really very thoroughly go for the argument analysis. So what's the claim? What are the arguments? And it brings me very far because stories, you know, the little stories can be anecdotes and they're arguments as well. So if you look at it from a persuasive, rhetorical, argumentative point of view, you can find a lot. That's what I do.
Yeah,
it works.
I think that might be a good approach, because I was trying to look at it in relation to fictional tactics, and I can see that they're being used, but I can't quite see what they're doing to the reader.
You know, this just on this about column, the relationship between columns and literary journalism. I have conducted a research on Eliane Bron, who Alice Trindade was quoted this morning as one of our finest literary journalists. And it's interesting because she really was, when she was writing for a magazine, Epoca. Then, in 2010, she moved to the portal to write for the website of it, and then she started writing columns. And then we collected the data of 1 year of her production. And then it shifted, you know, because it was not mostly literary journalism anymore, in the sense of reportage and things like that, you know, but it was more about reviews of books and movies, and then her personal view of certain things or happenings of her life. But you know, interviews, she started doing interviews and having them there. So it changed really from the printed edition to this. And now she's writing for El País. I haven't done research, and it's a bit different, you know. So I haven't thought about this overall change. But the Eliane Bron, people really say and they really adore. It's the first Eliane, the one who used to go to Amazon and stay there for a long time and immersed in that environment, you know, and write about parteiras in midwives and you know, this sort of content she was working, not the Eliane who writes columns.
So why is that? She just got tired of it? They ran out of money to finance it?
I think it's a money issue. I never did this part. I need some time to go there, interview her, and ask. My hypothesis is about money, and it's about now she has to deliver one piece every week. So it's time to.
That also changes the way you approach a piece of writing.
But when she goes back to books, then it's the first Eliane as well. So because she has
book reviews or book writing?
No, book writing. You know, she has done one for the Mid-Season Frontier, and so it's lovely again. So, but not in columns. I can. It's it's in Portuguese. You probably won't be.
I'm trying to learn it on Duolingo.
I can send you the link. Yeah, but.
Yeah, but what I was about to say actually complements your talk. Because you have raised, Lesley, you have raised this, I think it's an important question, like, how could you consider column writing as literary journalism? And I have dealt with this, not really this specific question myself. I wasn't dealing with column, but memoir writing, for example, comics journalism. And my strategy has been to consider literary journalism not as a genre or a form, but a set of journals and forms that could be really different from each other, that could be really mutually, they couldn't really talk to each other, and they would be really set apart. But what they have in common is that they are in this border of journalism and literature. They may use different techniques like fiction-like narrative or this argumentative structure. And actually, my main theoretical basis is Mikhail Bakhtin's speech genre theory, because by using his propositions, you don't have to fit like Aggrey's words in a genre, in a form. You don't have to fit this in a box, but you can take stuff from this box and say, okay, he does it like this. You can name his genre the way you prefer, and then you can point it, you can label it as literary journalism by trying to find points that match, but not by trying to compare his work with John Hersey's work or Hunter Thompson's work, which are not really, they don't look alike as well. I know it's a suggestion, but it really helps me. I try to identify some recurrent genres, but I think maybe it's better and it's more positive for the research field to not try to establish, okay, there are one genre, one form, or 10 genres, 10 forms, but to deal with this multitude of genres. So you can consider his work as literary journalism, but not by comparison. Good work better, yes. In case of Manuel, my question would be, how are you going to deal with this data? When you have interviewed these people, how are you going to interpret their answers? How are you going to, put this into your dissertation and criticize what they're saying, quote what they're saying? It's really out of curiosity, because I have written some earlier papers when I was dealing with what literary journalism is, and I was astounded by how many reporters are out there who do not consider themselves to be literary journalists, but they are for us. There are classical cases from the US, like Lyndon Ross, Norman Mailer. Mailer considered was depreciative. It was an accusation to be called a journalist, because this was a low profession. He was a writer. He was superior in his view, and for Lyndon Ross it was the opposite. She didn't consider herself to be an interpreter of reality. There are cases in Brazil as well. Helene Blum was in a seminar 10 years ago. It was a literary journalism seminar. She accepted the invitation, but she stated in front of the audience that she wasn't a literary reporter, she was just a reporter. And this may be interpreted in several ways. So I would like to know what's your plan.
Yes. So interestingly enough, the two older reporters that I interviewed didn't want to be called literary journalists. But the two younger were eager to and said it's literary journalism. So that's interesting. And the way that I'm working on these interviews is that my idea is to put the full interview, the transcript in the thesis. So if something is missing, at least the person that's reading the thesis can go read the interview. And the idea that I did is I'm going to select some answers and compare them with their writings, with some quotes, and pick one answer and to show all four answers and show why I thought this answer seemed more complete or more interesting. And so that's the way I'm doing it. So in each interview, I found what I consider to be the best answers. But then again, that could be one of the questions for the panel when I'm going to defend the thesis. They could say, "Well, you talk about this part, which is good."
And what are the criteria to define what's the best entry?
So
or what a best entry?
So since I constructed thinking on the books and what I've read about them, my idea is how they explain some of their choices. I can really see how some of them thought about the subject very much, about the idea about the subject of analysis. When one of the reporters said that he was interviewing homeless people and at a certain point that affected him, I think he was the best one to describe how he was affected by his subject of analysis. So I try and go there. If I think they've been better, or they explained it better, I should say.
I think we're going to have to stop there. Let's
Yeah, I just have a small question for Pascal.
Small question? We're at time. How about we give our people a round of applause and then you can come up and ask him?
It's just about
Okay, all right.
your research included e-books as well?
No, because this is mostly translation that were done in up to the year 2000. So ebooks would be basically we use bibliographical tools. We need to correlate different sources. So ebooks now wouldn't be part of. So we would find them. So they could potentially, but none were found.
Thank you. Simple.
It was a small question. All right, let's give a round of applause for